Now it's time to get started with our science panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this panel, and the folks that know they're on the panel can also come on up. The co-executive director of the Science and Environment Council, Mr. David Schaefer. All right, and here they come. Dr. Cindy Heil, the director of Mote Marine Laboratories Red Tide Institute. Mike Milet, the interim director of Sarasota County Public Utilities. Steve Swab, principal of Progressive Water Resources. And Dr. Mary Lusk, assistant professor at the University of Florida. David, you're ready to get us started.
Good afternoon, everybody. Water can exist without humans, but we cannot exist without water. And the quality of that water determines the quality of our lives. We've convened this panel here today to talk about the science of water quality, and in particular, nutrient pollution. Nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus, are good things. They're the building blocks of life. But like all good things, too much of them in the wrong place can cause problems. I'd like to do an old-fashioned, old-school Mentimeter with the audience with the question, how many people here have been impacted by harmful algal blooms in the last year or so, including red tide? Okay, that's almost everybody. Those algae need nutrients to bloom. Our strategy to reduce harmful algal blooms has been to reduce nutrients that feed them. In Sarasota County, the nutrient of primary management concern is nitrogen. There are many sources, human sources, of that nitrogen, including wastewater from conveyance and treatment plants, septic systems, pet waste, residential and agricultural fertilizers, and even the exhaust from our cars and power plants. As Sarasota has grown, we've increased the nitrogen that we put into the environment, and we've decreased the capacity of that environment to take it out. The good news is that we know a lot about nutrient pollution, and good science exists to reduce nitrogen pollution and improve water quality in Sarasota County. Today's panel is going to talk about the science of nitrogen pollution and other forms. Please join me in welcoming our panel. First up is Dr. Cindy Heil.
Good afternoon. How many of you think after last year that Southwest Florida is the epicenter of red tide in the Gulf? Yes, I'm here to tell you you're correct. This is a map of 62 years of red tide occurrence, and I've grouped in different areas the number of years with red tide. What's the first thing that strikes you about that graph? Southwest Florida is red tide central, probably in the Gulf of Mexico as well as the whole of the United States. Why? The question is why? Why are red tides so prone in this particular region? Well, two things I want you to keep in mind. We're talking about a single-celled plant that is motile. It swims, so it can access surface to bottom. And it's also not a very good competitor. It grows very slowly compared to other phytoplankton, and that's important. So I want to give you a little bit of a different perspective of the Southwest Florida. This is a bathymetry map. Now, you hear all the time that we know that from 1975, blooms start offshore on the West Florida shelf. This gives you an idea what we're talking about. There's a very unique characteristic of Southwest Florida is this very wide, very shallow shelf. Karenia hangs out toward the outer edges of this shelf. It can access the whole water column. There's not a lot competing with it out there, so it doesn't really have to worry about its growth rate. There is a nitrogen source offshore, cyanobacteria named trichodesmium that fixes nitrogen gas and excretes about 50%. So it's got its own nutrient source. And then it has the loop current, which is this current that comes up through the straits, loops around the Gulf, and then comes down to the Keys and joins the Gulf Stream on the east side. Well, occasionally this loop current moves to the east and causes upwelling. And the result of that is what it does is it moves this slow-growing bloom with its own nutrient source toward the shore. There's not much competing with it, so it doesn't matter if it's growing slowly. This can occur over weeks or over months, and you're not aware of it because it's happening at depth. As it moves towards shore, though, you can see there are different nutrient sources available to it, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Florida is naturally phosphorus rich from the Hawthorne phosphate deposits, and as you move south, the Everglades actually exports organic nitrogen. Both of those are significant to these blooms. So, a little bit about the basics. What nutrients does Karenia brevis need? It's a plant. It must photosynthesize. It absolutely has to have light. But it also needs nitrogen, phosphorus, like every other plant, certain trace metals, certain vitamins. What nutrients can it use? And this is where Karenia kind of comes into its own, and you need to be aware of. Like other plants, it uses inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus. I might slip into N and P. I mean nitrogen and phosphorus when I do. Nitrate, ammonia, orthophosphate. But unlike a lot of other phytoplankton, it can use organic, chemically complex N and P. This includes amino acids, humic compounds, larger molecules that it has the enzymes to utilize. And then recently, in the last 10 years, there's been 2 studies that suggest that in addition to these nutrients, it may be able to use particulate nutrients. It may actually be able to consume one of the very small cyanobacteria out there. We have a big question mark over this because it's only been shown in cultures, and when we look for it in blooms, we've never seen it. So we know what it needs, we know what it uses. What does it prefer? The lower left is culture studies. We know it prefers ammonia. But that being said, it will take up nitrate in equal amounts to urea, followed by, amino acids and particulate nitrogen. Well, what does it do in situ, in the bloom? And I've summarized a whole variety of blooms that we've sampled in this one pie chart, but if you look at that, you see these blooms prefer ammonia, NH4, followed by nitrate, then urea, and then amino acids. So this particular organism definitely has a nitrogen preference. Well, what are the sources of nutrients for Karenia? Some of these you're going to recognize and some you might not. To date, we've identified over 13 different sources and quantified. So we have numbers to put with these sources. Everything from to the right, the estuarine nearshore sources, the runoff, the human as well as natural that everybody's concerned about, but others such as photochemistry, nutrients from the sediments, nutrients from the atmosphere, internally recycled nutrients, nutrients from dead fish. The thing about these nutrients is that they're not constant. They vary with the bloom stage, the bloom age, and the bloom location. This is kind of a complicated graph, but if you start at the top on the left, offshore, and below that, it's bloom stage, and then it shows you the different nutrient sources that we think are important. And then as you move to the right, the bloom develops and it moves near shore, and you can see how these sources change. We lose upwelling, but we gain the coastal nutrient inputs. So at any given time, looking at the nutrient sources supporting a bloom is a complex endeavor, and you can see why here. How have scientists tracked nutrient sources for red tide? There's a lot of interest in this. It is in the scientific literature if you look, and I'd be happy to provide references. There's 4 methods, really. We compare source measurements, the flux, how much N and how much P is produced from these sources. And I'll show you a graph in a minute. We have biogeochemical models we have used for Karenia, and we use these. Once we get a working model, we can subtract out a source and see what the impacts are on the bloom. And we can kind of judge how important a certain source is. We use stable isotopes, stable nitrogen isotopes. Nitrogen naturally occurs in 2 forms, one with 14 neutrons and one with 15. And the ratio of these 2 forms is very characteristic of the nutrient source, whether it's nitrogen fixation, fertilizer, or sewage. And so we can use this signature to track where the nutrients, the nitrogen, is coming from. And we also use something called nutrient stoichiometry. Essentially, if we know how many cells are there, we can calculate how much N and P made those cells, and we can compare those to the fluxes. Well, what are the fluxes? This is kind of a summary graph. I wish I could go into depth on all 4 of the different methods, but in 7 minutes, you're kind of limited. The key point here is the estuarine flux. Although it's significant, it pales in comparison to fish, zooplankton excretion, decaying trichodesmium. I get asked a lot about the Caloosahatchee. This is my Caloosahatchee in one slide. Yes, we had high discharge last year and a bad red tide, but we've had years with high discharge and not so bad red tide, low discharge, and a bad red tide. If you look at the actual flux measurements out the river on the right, you can see 2018, there was a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus coming out the river, but there was a lot in 2010, and we didn't have a bloom in 2010. So it's very difficult for scientists to point a finger at this river as the cause of strong red tides near shore. So what about transported microcystis? And I'm talking very fast because I have 30 seconds. Microcystis blooms in Lake Okeechobee. A couple of myths. Karenia does not consume microcystis, and it doesn't fix nitrogen gas. It competes with Karenia for nutrients. We do know these blooms are linked to nutrient enrichment. You will not get a scientist to argue with that. How much do these blooms support Karenia? Well, we did the nutrient stoichiometry, and the bottom line is at the bottom of the graph. About 30% of a small bloom last summer could be supported by the decay of this cyanobacteria coming from Lake O out the Caloosahatchee. Whoop, excuse me. So, some very fast conclusions. What do I want you to take away? There's a lot of nutrients out there and nutrient sources, and from our calculations, there's enough out there to support all but the very largest blooms, like the very intense one we had last year. Reduction of nearshore nutrients where possible should be implemented for a variety of whether it's human health, environmental health, economies. But right now, the science simply doesn't support the fact that if you eliminate those nutrients, you will eliminate red tide. You might localize, reduce the severity, but there's simply too much nutrients out there. So that circles us around, why was the 17 to 19 bloom so bad? Truthfully, we don't know. We suspect climate change may be playing a role, but that's something open for investigation at this point. And thank you. I've never talked that fast in my life.
Good afternoon. I want to first thank you all for being here. You're going to hear a lot from the dais today from various people, but I want to also say there's a lot of expertise in the audience, and a lot of you have taught me over the years. So, one does not necessarily need to be a scientist to apply science and understand how to solve problems with it. As an engineer, that's what I do on my best days. You don't need to be a historian to be an advocate for what history can teach us. And you don't need to be a biologist to witness the resiliency and efficiency of nature to heal if given a chance. We do have a nutrient management problem, and we'd be well served to consult with science, history, and nature to do a better job as we move forward. And it really wasn't that long ago, we heard some stories earlier, within the lifetime of many people in this room, that our bays and estuaries were so abundant with life that it was hard to imagine that even today, how live they were. Meanwhile, over the past several decades, the number of Florida waterways designated as impaired for nutrients has continued to grow, and nitrogen levels in our own bays have been trending upwards. So it is now expected that all of our bay segments in Sarasota County will be designated as impaired for nutrients in 2020. The sources of these nutrients, as discussed from the landscape, can be the overuse of fertilizer and wastewater byproducts such as effluent water and biosolids. Stormwater is then the conduit that transports these nutrients to our bays. To understand the magnitude of stormwater runoff, one only need understand Florida's past drainage obsession, or as it was called at the time, land reclamation. One of the earliest and most effective drainage efforts in Sarasota County was the Sarasota Fruitville Drainage District that created miles of ditches to drain large wetland systems throughout the landscape like a giant connect-the-dots puzzle. These wetlands and the uplands that drain to them were connected to a relatively small tidal Philippi Creek that was straightened, deepened, and widened to carry more water. The primary reason was for agriculture, draining the wetlands to grow celery. In the following decades, these drainage efforts were repeated to varying degrees over the Sarasota County landscape for agriculture, land development, and mosquito control. As a result, we have an extensive and efficient water transportation system that also forms the water veins of life for the ecosystem in which it resides. The watershed ecosystem is dynamic, always looking to use nutrients as food. But as more and more nutrients are added, it can overwhelm the system so that any rainfall event that creates runoff can mobilize and transport these excess nutrients downstream. To offset the effects of overdrainage, watershed restoration and stormwater recycling are effective strategies. The county's Selby Fields and Donna Bay projects are good examples of initiatives that can enhance historical floodplain and water filtration, as well as restore a more natural flow of water on the landscape and to the receiving bays and estuaries. They put water back where it used to be, and they can also often provide significant wildlife and recreational benefits, as we know. Relative to the concentration or intensity of nutrients in nature's waters, the state of Florida has adopted specific limits for nitrogen and phosphorus. These numeric nutrient limits are used as a surrogate for healthy biology, as the state's original and surviving narrative criteria essentially says that nutrient concentrations of a body of water cannot impact aquatic life. So maintaining natural biology is the real measure for success. As indicated, the nutrients of concern are phosphorus and nitrogen. Sarasota County is in a unique geological formation which is naturally richer in phosphorus than on, say, the other side of the Highlands Ridge and most of coastal Florida. Over the eons, our environment has adapted to these higher phosphorus concentrations. And so lawns and golf courses in this area may be able to exclude phosphorus from fertilizer. On the other hand, okay, this is the big one. On the other hand, our waterways are typically sensitive to nitrogen. Interestingly, nitrogen, like water, can exist in three forms: gas, solid, and liquid. And like the water hydrologic cycle, there is a natural nitrogen cycle. At 78%, nitrogen is actually the most common element in the atmosphere, where it is very stable. But there are natural bacteria in the soil, plants, and water that can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And at the other end of the cycle, there are also natural bacteria that can convert nitrate nitrogen to nitrogen gas, releasing it back to the atmosphere through a wonderful thing called denitrification. The natural nitrogen cycle relies on these bacteria, and here's the key. On the landscape, these bacteria typically require healthy soil to exist. And the single best indicator of healthy soil is the percentage that is organic carbon. Soil devoid of organic carbon typically cannot support bacteria or life in general. So reactive nitrogen fertilizer that has been chemically extracted from the atmosphere using the Haber-Bosch method must be applied for things to grow. Responsible for the green revolution, the Haber-Bosch method is a man-made disruptor to the natural nitrogen cycle, with an unintended consequence of adding more nitrogen to our soils and water than can be naturally denitrified. Understanding and mimicking these natural processes, there are passive organic media, as simple as wood chips and potentially biochar, which is made by heating organic waste with limited oxygen. This is essentially organic carbon sources that can host the bacteria, which facilitates the natural nitrogen cycle and in particular denitrification. There are numerous applications for this media that show promise for cost-effectively reducing nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations from wastewater, stormwater, and even septic tank influent. We are successfully testing this media for several years out at Lakewood Ranch to reduce nutrients in reclaimed water with funding from the Southwest Florida Water Management District and expertise from the University of Florida. It's become clear to this recovering engineer that we need to mimic the science behind these time-tested natural processes and employ them at both the micro and watershed scales to reduce excess nutrients and protect the health and life of our waters. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to give you a quick 7-minute primer on primary wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment once it leaves your home, okay? It gets into the collection system in a variety of ways. Some of you are on vacuum systems, some of you are on gravity collection systems, some have grinder systems that actually pump into the collection system. But eventually it'll make its way to a lift station. There are over 700 lift stations within the Sarasota County collection system. These lift stations can look as simple as a couple pipes above ground, or they can be complex buildings in the neighborhood of 20 by 20. Once it leaves that lift station, it makes its way to the treatment plant. This is where the treatment process begins. At the headworks of the treatment plant, this is where all the sewage goes through. At the headworks, we screen it. We remove all the big particles. You would be surprised what actually comes through a collection system, but 2x4s, bricks, rocks, all kinds of material makes its way through the collection system to the headworks. Once it moves through the headworks, we move into the treatment process. The treatment process for wastewater treatment is a biological process. We use biology to eat the bad bacteria with the good bacteria, okay? Once we feed the sewage to the good bacteria, we put it into clarification. A clarifier gives the bacteria a chance to settle. The clear water rises to the top, and the bacteria settle to the bottom of the clarifier. We take some of that bacteria that settled to the bottom of the clarifier and put that back into the front of the plant to feed it and help grow more bacteria, and then we take some of that bacteria that's settled and send that off to waste, because we have to maintain that delicate balance. After we've fed the bacteria, we've let them rest, now we're going to filter all the small particles out. We put this through a sand filter process. This is a similar process to what you have in your pool system. A little bit more complicated, but a similar type concept. We filter the water before it moves through the process into the disinfection process. Disinfection is where we use chlorine to treat the harmful bacteria that are still in the water column. Once we've treated the water, filtered it, disinfected it, we put it into our ponds and our storage tanks and send that back out. That is what's called reclaimed water. All right? Reclaimed water has been through the entire treatment process. Secondary wastewater treatment process is designed to treat sewage for public health reasons. Primary goal is to protect public health with secondary wastewater treatment. As we move forward, we have the solids component that Steve had mentioned, the biosolids. That's the dead bacteria that we take. We use this, we spin this down and make a pudding out of this and make compost. We add wood chips to this and make compost and sell this to the agricultural community. A lot of questions have been raised recently about AWT. AWT is Advanced Wastewater Treatment. Advanced Wastewater Treatment is defined in Florida statutes as water that meets these 4 criteria. There are many, many different ways to achieve these numbers. There are tanks that we can install here for anoxic. We can install re-aeration tanks here. We can move to a membrane process in this location. We can add chemicals in the filtration process. There are a lot of different methods that can be used to achieve advanced wastewater treatment. Advanced wastewater treatment is that portion of taking the nutrients out of the water column. Remember, secondary treatment is for public health. Now we're moving into the evolution of taking the nutrients out of the water column. That's the whole principle behind advanced wastewater treatment.
All right, Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm excited to be able to come and talk to you at this summit today. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about the science that we do. So I'm Mary Lusk. I'm from University of Florida. I'm in the Soil and Water Sciences Department at University of Florida, and I was hired specifically to look at urban water quality issues, and specifically on Florida's Gulf Coast area. So I work a lot on this side of Florida, doing a lot of research on urban waters and water quality in our urban areas, and it's great, and it's an exciting thing that I do, and I love it. So today I want to talk to you about things in our home neighborhoods, at the home scale, our lawns and our home sites, and the connections between what we do as homeowners and as residents in our communities and water quality in our larger communities and in the state of Florida. And I hope that this picture on the front here really drives home connections to you. That's my hope, is that you can see that what you're doing at your home level, at your lawn, and in your community is connected to what flows into our stormwater. And stormwater, of course, and many times is conveyed on to a stream or a creek or a river, and then that is then conveyed on to our estuaries and our bays, Sarasota Bay, Tampa Bay. So think about these connections, and as I talk today, I hope you'll keep this kind of image in your mind and those connections between what we do at home and the water quality out there in our bay. So this image, I put up some potential sources of nutrients to urban stormwater that can be conveyed onto our waters, and all of those things are there that are things that we need to address at the homeowner level. Of course, fertilizer is a source. There are other sources as well. Pet waste and leaf litter. This time of year, particularly around February, March, anybody's storm drains look like that one in the picture there with lots of oak leaf litter accumulated in it. We see a lot of that in our springs in Florida in springtime. Grass clippings, of course, can be a source of nitrogen and phosphorus. Reclaimed water can be a source, and this is if that reclaimed water is not used wisely. We absolutely need to use reclaimed water in Florida from a water quantity perspective, but we need to use it wisely. So remember that it can have nitrogen and phosphorus in it as well, so don't irrigate the sidewalks. Don't irrigate the sidewalks in the streets, and we're using it wisely. On that picture on the right there, you see a picture of some bare soil. That's a lawn that's it's in not good shape, right? The turf quality is not really good. What happens when that bare soil is exposed to stormwater, exposed to rainwater? Well, that rainwater picks up that soil and carries it on. In the picture next to it, you see the gutter. That gutter is right in front of that bad quality lawn. You see how much soil is in that? Well, our soils in this part of Florida have a lot of phosphorus in them. So that crappy quality lawn can be a source of nutrients to the stormwater because they're contributing eroded soil to the stormwater. So just some sources there to think about in a typical neighborhood and community setting. So how do we figure out which source is most important in a given situation? How do we figure out where they come from? Well, this is exactly what I study. I have a little group of graduate students in my lab at University of Florida. We spend a lot of time going out in residential communities all over this part of Florida when it rains. You will see us standing out in the community with our stormwater collection bottles, and we're in our rain gear, and we're drenched head to toes, and people come up to us and say, "Do you need any help? Is there something wrong with your car?" I'm like, no, we're just collecting stormwater samples. But we go out in neighborhoods so that we can learn where nutrients are coming from in the stormwater. And this is a study that we did a couple years ago in Hillsborough County. And the green little block areas on that map are home sites. So there are lots in a neighborhood. The little blue circles, what do you think those are in that neighborhood? The storm drains, the gutters that drain stormwater. And the blue lines are the pipes, the underground pipes that convey that stormwater. And they all go out to that stormwater pond, the little blue circle on the left side of that map. So all the stormwater from that neighborhood goes to that pond, and then it's conveyed onward to the Alafaya River, which is a tributary of Tampa Bay. So again, think about that connection. So that was a study site that we used. We collected stormwater one rainy season, and we used isotopic characterization of N to track sources of particulate nitrogen in this case. We've heard earlier today about isotopic characterization. I'll be happy to go into the science of that with anybody more if you want to. But it's a way that we track where nitrogen is coming from. So here's a graph showing our results. On the top, we have rainfall coming down. That's just rainfall depth coming down throughout that rainy season. On the bottom is nitrogen concentration in that stormwater throughout the rainy season again. What do you notice on the left side of that graph? Big pulse of nitrogen early in the rainy season, right? Where that pink bar is a lot higher than the rest of the season. In this case, we were able to track the nitrogen is coming from this stuff right here, leaf litter and grass clippings in the storm basins. So really good take-home point here is clean those basins out. We call that a seasonal first flush. When we early in the season, when we see this big flush of material coming out of the stormwater. So think about it. During the dry season, all of that leaf litter stuff is sitting there on the streets all dry season long. And then the rainy season comes, we start flushing that stuff into the stormwater. So in this case, that's where a good portion of that nitrogen was coming from. This is from another study. This was done in Hillsborough and Manatee County, very similar. In this instance, we used isotopic characterization to look at nitrate sources of nitrogen. This is an inorganic form of nitrogen. Collected stormwater in a rainy season from 6 residential neighborhoods. And you'll see there at the top right-hand side how we partitioned out the sources. This is what it came out to be. So about 35 to 64% of the nitrate in this sample was from atmospheric deposition. That's just rainfall. Nitrogen that's naturally in the environment. We had some from fertilizers, and we had some from soil. Again, we've talked about that already. We had some phosphorus coming from soil as well, so very important, again, looking at those sources. This graph shows reclaimed water as a potential source. Just want to point out the top peaks of this graph is where a community was irrigating with reclaimed water. The bottom peaks where nitrogen concentration is very low, that's where they were irrigating with potable water. Again, we have to use reclaimed water in Florida, but use it wisely. Do not water the sidewalks and the streets, or we see graphs like this. So just some take-home messages for you. The multiple sources of nutrients in our residential communities. So we need more than just fertilizer ordinances. We need regulations and work that looks at multiple sources of nutrients. We need to match management with time and location, such as taking care of that leaf litter in the streets. Things like street sweeping can be really important for us. And so those are things that we can do in our communities to address stormwater pollution from a neighborhood scale. So my time is up, so I'll stop there. I would love to take any questions later after the event today from people, and I'll also talk a little bit about septic systems if anybody's interested in that. So thank you.
For organizing this panel. Thank you, panel, and as I said, thank you to Dr. Abby Tierna from UF IFAS for organizing this panel. We're now moving into the question and answer section of the panel. The first part of that will be questions submitted during your registrations. And so we'll start off the first question with Steve Swaw. How do we monitor water quality, and what do we test for?
Typically, as indicated, you have sample bottles. There's field tests that occur. You can measure things like salinity, temperature, conductivity, total dissolved solids, typically in the field when you take the sample. The samples then need to go to the lab, and typically the lab will monitor for whatever you request. But the typical parameters that you'll see, for example, on the Sarasota County Water Atlas are different nitrogen constituents, nitrogen, nitrate, nitrate, ammonia, nitrogen, and TKN. Phosphorus, of course, the other nutrient. And other things that might typically be sampled for in the lab are chlorophyll A, dissolved oxygen, and total suspended solids.
Steve, you mentioned the Water Atlas. Could you tell us more about what that is and how we can access that?
Yeah, and I saw that John Ryan snuck in, so John can be grabbed, or Justin Sarin, who's I believe here, that runs the Water Atlas. It's a great tool. It's open to the public, and through that portal, you can get access to a map of all the monitoring stations in the state of Florida. You can zoom in on the stream or the area of your interest, the waterway where you live, and look at any of the water data that's in that area and look at the different nutrients. Typically, Sarasota County has been monitoring their waterways monthly, I think, since 2006. So there's a lot of really good data that can be looked at and analyzed and evaluated.
Thanks, Steve. Mike, how does Sarasota manage its aging infrastructure?
Aging infrastructure is not just a Sarasota County issue, it's a countrywide issue. In Sarasota County, we have dedicated programs where we're spending upwards of $15 million a year to rehabilitate not only our collection systems, our water mains, our force mains, our gravity mains, our lift stations. So we invest millions of dollars on an annual basis to keep the system as tight and effective as possible.
Thanks, Mike. One of the most popular questions we received with registration is how can we mitigate red tide?
Well, mitigation is actually three different things. It's prevention, it's control, and then it's actually mitigating or relieving the impacts. In terms of prevention, we're in the infancy right now. We have to find it offshore at very low concentrations. And that's very difficult to do. You saw that whole West Florida shelf, it's huge. Molecular techniques are showing some promise for that. That's in the future. We're focused right now on control. This can be biological, chemical, physical, or environmental controls. Everything from the small docks that are put under living docks, basically, where filter feeding organisms colonize under a dock and filter out red tide, to specific compounds such as clays, such as ozone, algicides. We're testing, I believe we have a list up to 50 compounds right now. We're rigorously testing scientifically. Determine if they work. If they kill the cells, which just about everything kills Corynea, believe it or not. The problem is the toxins that are released when the cells die. Not a lot of things destroy the toxins, probably less than 10% of the things we've tried. And the other thing is mitigation as in alleviating the impacts. And this kind of relies on the person themselves. This is something you deal with personally. We're very good right now at monitoring in terms of demonstrating where the blooms are. We have the beaches condition reporting system at MOAT. They get twice weekly updates from lifeguards at all the beaches in Southwest Florida. You can go to that site and see if there's dead fish. You can see if there's respiratory irritation. Fish and Wildlife has been monitoring red tide for years. They put out bi-weekly reports of where the bloom is in terms of cell concentration. What we've done with that over the years, though, is evolve it. Those numbers have been combined with the physical measurements to yield 3-day forecasts. They predict based on currents where those cells are going to end up. So you can look at the reports and say, oh, tomorrow is not good at Lido Beach. Let's go to Disney World. Those counts are also used by NOAA with wind forecasts to predict where respiratory irritation is going to be. So we have made huge progress in terms of alleviating some of the impacts. In terms of personal responsibility, people will ask me the question, what about nutrients? It is always a good thing to reduce your nutrient footprint. Locally, that can improve the local red tide conditions, not the whole bloom itself, especially these monster blooms like we had last year. So that's kind of a quick overview of the state of mitigation right now of red tide.
Cindy, another popular question during registration was, what can people do on their own property to reduce their input for nutrient pollution? Mary?
Yeah, so great question. So, I mean, you saw from some of the data that I presented in the one neighborhood that was in Hillsborough, Manatee County. We estimated that greater than 50% of the nitrate in that stormwater was simply from atmospheric deposition, so it's just in the rainfall. Well, what can we do about that? So, well, we can prevent the rain from falling on impervious surfaces. So as much as possible, make sure that we keep pervious surfaces. If you can have a rain garden on your property, or if you can harvest that rainwater from your roof, maybe get a rain barrel and then reuse that in your garden or in your turf. If you have drain pipes coming from your roof, don't divert those to the driveway. That just goes right to the stormwater system. And, divert that and channel that stormwater to a pervious surface like your turf or a garden. Of course, fertilizers are a source. Use fertilizers wisely. Talk with your local IFAS extension office about, University of Florida recommendations for how and when to apply those. That's a great thing to do. You saw also in the data that I presented that leaf litter and grass clippings can certainly be a source of nutrients in residential communities. So keep that stuff out of the stormwater system. Go out and, clean that up around your yard and compost it instead of letting it accumulate in the stormwater system. Had a really great study we did this summer over on the east coast of Florida in the Indian River Lagoon. Very similar, we were looking at sources of nitrate and stormwater from home sites, and in that case, we had one particular yard. The neighbor, the resident in the home was very proud to tell us that they use no fertilizer, which was great. We're proud of them for that. But they have a beautiful black lab in the backyard that they don't clean up after, and guess what? When we analyzed the stormwater from that yard, guess where all the nitrate was coming from? Beautiful black lab that they don't clean up after. And it's a small thing. It seems like such a small thing, but it can be a significant part of the contribution. So clean up after your pets. So all of those things are things that we can do, and there's probably many more, but a great place to start to find more information would be the folks at the IFAS Extension Office. They have tons of information on that sort of stuff.
Thanks, Mary. Last question of this session. Steve, you touched on some next generation scientific innovations that involve wood chips and biochar. Could you talk a little bit more about how those might be applied to reduce nutrients?
Yeah, so wood chips are a carbon source that hosts the bacteria that can cause denitrification if they're in an anaerobic condition, i.e. without oxygen. So different applications that are being looked at. There's, for example, a nursery that has high nitrite levels up in the Swanee River Water Management District, and this is one of, I think, Mary's colleagues that looked at it. We work with that nursery. Very high nitrate that gets into the groundwater that seeps into the waterways. They constructed about a 5-foot wide by 7-foot deep trench, mix that sandy soil with, in this case, sawdust, and put it back in. That sawdust acts as a carbon source, and it's effective at catching that nitrate and converting it back into nitrogen gas through denitrification. Very effective. The studies I've seen said that can last for 15, 20, 50 years even, some studies say. So, but it needs to be anaerobic. Those kind of barriers could be put along waterways and lakes that are susceptible to nitrate, which is potentially from septic tanks. It could be a way to reduce nitrate without hooking everybody up to sewer. Could be much more cost effective, in other words. And biochar is any organic matter can be, if it's burned without oxygen, can be converted into charcoal. And that's basically what happens in a forest fire. If you go out after a controlled burn, you'll see that the palms and the palmettos have basically char on them. They've been charred where the oxygen, there was not a lot of oxygen at the base. That's nature's way of putting carbon back in the soil and why the system regenerates. But that biochar, and it's somewhat tricky. We've played around with that a lot, and there's a carbon expert up at University of Florida that's been working with us. We've been able to customize biochar to form natural mineral deposits on some of the feedstocks that will absorb phosphorus. Some of the biochar we're looking at is actually getting 100% removal of phosphorus with 15 minutes of contact time. So again, phosphorus is not a big deal here, but it is just about everywhere else, including the Everglades. So I think these are all natural process organic material. So there's several applications. We're looking at putting wood chips in lakes that have nitrogen for denitrification, and we're using it, like I said, out at Lakewood Ranch to convert reclaimed water from Manatee County to meet AWT standards. We've been doing that. So,
thanks, Steve. And that wraps up the first part of our question session. The second part, we'll take questions from the Menti and also from cards. I'll ask the panel to sort of browse the screen for those questions, and we'll start with a card question. Mike, this one might be for you. Why do we need reclaimed water in Florida?
Potable water is a finite resource. We know that in Sarasota County, we get approximately 80% of our drinking water from surface water sources. Most of the time, that's a pretty reliable, but we've been through droughts before where we've had to reduce our the use of potable water. One of the easiest, simplest ways to reduce use of potable water is by using reclaimed water for irrigation purposes. And it's not just irrigation purposes for residential, your homes, but it's also on golf courses, on sod farms, on agriculture. Those are huge users of water. If we can reduce the amount of pumping of groundwater, reduce the amount of potable water we use, we're prolonging the life of the aquifer in this area to help us maintain our potable water resources. The second reason we need to use reclaimed water is that's the primary disposal method that we use in Sarasota County to get rid of our wastewater that's been through the treatment process. It's easy to treat wastewater in Florida. It's very difficult to get rid of it. If you put it down a deep injection well, it's a waste. It goes down there and it disappears. You never see it again. If you use it as reclaimed water for irrigation, you're reusing that water. It's the water cycle all in one. It starts in potable water. You turn it into wastewater. You give it to me, I clean it up, and I give it back to you as reclaimed water. We're continuously using that resource, the best use for that resource.
Thanks. There is a quick question there. How do I access the Water Atlas?
Type in Water Atlas, go to Google, go to the Google and type in Sarasota County Water Atlas. And I think there's an icon there for data download. And if you go to that, a map of the whole state of Florida pops up with all the monitoring sites on it. Very user-friendly.
There's a question now. How do our creeks' water quality compare to healthy systems?
Well, a lot of them are not natural systems. They're man-made. But there was back in the 1939, 1940s, at least one of the first, maybe the first lab for investigating natural systems, our waterways, was set up down in Lemon Bay called the Bass Lab. Mote Marine now has all of that original data. But that data would tell us what this place was like before the intercoastal, before all the general development and all the drainage canals back in the 1930s and 40s, and before we kind of started having our way with the land, kind of what it would be left up to nature. I've seen some of the data. It's intriguing to see what this place was like back then. It pretty much coincides with a lot of the stories I've heard from folks that have lived here their entire life and what they remember, with the scallops and oysters in the bay. This place sounds like it used to be like the Bahamas in its natural state. So if we wanted to really get a true indication of what this place is like in a natural, with nature kind of taking control, that data from back in the 1930s and 40s I think would be really invaluable to analyze. And it's available, it's there, just I don't think it's ever been really analyzed.
Mary, this one looks like one for you. Do you think that requiring new developments to use native plant species for landscaping would help reduce the need for fertilizers and water?
So that's a big depends. I mean, one of the things that we teach a lot at University of Florida and in IFAS and in Extension is right plant for the right place. And it's going to depend a lot on the particular environment that neighborhood is in, but definitely, there are alternatives to traditional landscaping that we use in Florida. Definitely there are native plants and shrubs and other things that can use less water and require less nutrients or are adapted to the shade. And so, remember, a really crappy turf lawn is probably just as bad or not worse as one that's improperly fertilized because of soil erosion and the problems associated with that. So definitely using the right plant in the right place, and if that's a Florida native species, definitely we encourage the use of that.
And use compost.
And use compost. We have a wonderful research study going on right now at University of Florida in a new development that looks at compost and how that can reduce runoff from neighborhoods and improve water quality a lot, so use compost.
Thanks, Mary. Cindy?
I saw a question up there about the Mississippi River contributing to red tides. What we know about the Mississippi is it is the cause of the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi that reoccurs every year. The size varies. The nutrients cause this bloom, which essentially grows to its highest capacity, sinks, decays, and it becomes anoxic, and that affects the region. We've tried to track the Mississippi plume down to southwest Florida because scientists have had that same question. And it's kind of interesting, if we go back to that bathymetry of West Florida shelf, where we see the signature of the Mississippi River is right at the far out to sea at the edge of that shelf. And when we see it, what it is a salinity signal, low salinity water in the surface. But at that point, by the time it gets to Florida, it's been stripped of nutrients. So it's potentially possible to contribute to a red tide if that tide is up in Pensacola, where they're transported from Southwest Florida, yes. But for Southwest Florida, our thinking at the moment is it's probably not contributing to the blooms down here.
Mike, did you see?
Yeah, there was another question up there that talked about access to reclaimed water. As new development comes in, we require new development to install reclaimed water systems. In existing neighborhoods, it's very difficult and usually cost prohibitive to install a central irrigation system to be fed by a reclaimed water system. So most of the new developments, new subdivisions coming in are connecting to reclaimed water, and some of the larger developments, some of the, Schroeder Manatee Ranch, for example, we enter into utility agreements with them where we require that they take back as much reclaimed water as they give us in wastewater, so that there's a balance between what they give us and what they take back.
Here's a question that came in on a card. How does pumping my septic tank out help the environment?
Do you want to take that or you want?
Go for it.
Big question. So the question was, how does pumping my septic tank help the environment? Absolutely pump that tank on a regular basis. In most cases for a regular home, residential home, most cases on average, that's going to be 3 to 5 years. Pumping your septic tank is very good to do from a public health perspective, absolutely necessary to do to keep that thing functioning well and prevent public health problems and the spread of bacteria in the environment, so to protect the environment from bacteria. There's not a lot of evidence that pumping that tank will do a lot to help remove nitrogen from that septic waste. So still do it, absolutely do it from a public health perspective and from a perspective of keeping your tank functioning properly. Unfortunately, from a nitrogen reduction perspective, we probably don't get much benefit if it's a conventional septic tank, and I could probably talk for the next 2 hours about that. So if you want to catch me after the summit today, during that last hour, I'll be happy to talk some more about that. But short answer, from a bacteria perspective, absolutely, it's wonderful and it's important and does help. From a nitrogen reduction perspective, we probably get very little benefit from that.
So I had a number of questions up there about drinking water, and we have one on a card. How do we make sure our drinking water is safe?
The potable water is probably some of the most tested water we have in Sarasota. We test that on a daily basis. We maintain compliance with not only the EPA, but the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It's tested for both chemical and bacteriological tests. I don't know what else to say of that one. I consider potable water one of the highest tested units that we have in Sarasota County. It happens to fall under my area of responsibility, and just to pat the folks that actually produce the water on the back, Sarasota County's water has been named the best tasting water in this region for several years. So we're very proud of the water that we produce in Sarasota County.
Great, thanks. With that, our time is up. Join me in thanking the panel.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cindy. Thank you, Dr. Mary, David, Steve, and Mike. Good job.